Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce.
So let's talk about redlining. Redlining became illegal in the United States as early as 1968. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act was followed by the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act in 1975, which was a predecessor to the Community Reinvestment Act, both of which were an attempt to ensure that people who were living in low-income minority neighborhoods could actually get loans. And these things were very effective. In 1992, researchers at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston tried to look at the data. They collected information on some 30 variables related to lending decisions. They found that virtually all of the difference between minority and non-minority denial rates was explained by those variables. A reanalysis of that information found that black-owned banks were actually lending to white-owned businesses at higher rates than they were lending to black-owned businesses. Furthermore, if it seemed that banks were discriminating against black borrowers on the basis of they needed to have higher credit qualifications, what you would see is lower default rates from black clients of banks, from people who are borrowing money from banks in the black community. There are zero studies that show any of this. So the bottom line is this. Redlining was an evil and awful policy. It was made illegal in the 1960s. By the 1980s, the banks were not lending at disproportionate rates. In fact, if you look at among different communities, as Thomas Sowell has pointed out, Asian Americans get loans more easily than white Americans. That does not mean the banks are being racist toward white Americans on behalf of Asian Americans. When it comes to college education, it is also worth noting that, yes, there were many universities that were segregated. There were many universities that did not allow black people to attend. Since the 1970s, the most prominent measure that has been used in order to admit black students to major universities across the country has been affirmative action, which actively discriminates against people who are not black in favor of black applicants, specifically by ensuring that black applicants don't have to have the same test scores or GPAs in order to get into those same schools. So not only has policy been corrected, it's been overcorrected in these areas.
Kevin's grandparents on the
All right, he did say a lot, and I think to Elijah's kind of point earlier, there's a lot, he cites a lot of like information that, you know, on it, to be honest, like I haven't done like a lot of the research into what he's talking about, nor have I like carefully in detail like look at the studies. But the inherent argument of the video, right, is Jamal's grandparents, right? It's like Jamal's grandparents were, you know, had less opportunities than Kevin's grandparents. And then he cites acts from 1968, 1975, and the Reinvestment Act that he cites says 2006 and then effective in 2012. I'm not a legal expert, so I don't fully know what the dates mean and when exactly they were implemented and enacted. But that would still, if you look at those dates, that would still fundamentally affect Kevin's grandparents. So regardless of how you would look at it, there's still one there. Jamal would be at least one generation behind where Kevin is at. And, you know, you can't argue, right, that some things have corrected, but again, these individuals are affected by that. He also cites things like GPAs, SATs, etc. But literally 5 minutes ago, we were talking about how Jamal doesn't go to the same school as Kevin. So the opportunities aren't the same, like right off the bat. And then something I wanted to add earlier, Elijah, to your point about going to a different district. NPR actually had a really good segment about that where they talk about some schools where they did that. And kids go from their bad school to like a good school and they spend like a day or a week, and it completely changed the outlook of some kids. Now, oftentimes though, right, that nurture environment kind of severely like affects you. And you will see that, you know, not every student, even when they're exposed to situations, like they may get to a college. So let's say you're like a minority or black person, whatever, in the 70s, you go to college, you may be like one of five, right? And it's like, regardless of, like, these studies show that psychologically that affects you when you're the only one that sticks out, like, from your community, right? And plenty of studies have actually shown that, you know, being involved in having a community is like a key indicator for success, like in colleges, right? So that, in and of itself, even though it's like you can't just enact something today and just say, okay, this is solved indefinitely, right? It's not like a UNICEF function. It's not just immediately solved. It takes a little bit of time. It's kind of gradual, right? Yeah. So that's kind of my take on his argument. I mean, of course, there's a lot of research that could be done, and, you know, more factual information could be cited, but it's kind of how I think about it.
I think the way I'm coming at it is, we see that there was a problem back in the day. We made laws to try to fix the problem or negate some of the things that government was doing, because these were government enacted policies that screwed black people and minorities. So we tried to reverse policies that did that, and then also banks discriminated, etc. we tried to fix it, and a lot of it didn't work. Okay, it fixed some things, a lot of it didn't work. As a policymaker, as someone in government, if you see something that doesn't work, you got to try other things, and you got to look at research and see what other things will work. That's where I'm coming from all the time. Okay, and based on the initial plan that I said before, where it's like, okay, put people in different neighborhoods and see how that works. If that is proven to not work, do something else, because all I care about are the outcomes of these kids. I'm almost like, I stick to that position that I have because of, anecdotally, that's what happened to me. Like, I saw a completely different way of looking at life when I changed schools, and I'm pretty sure it happened to a lot of people. But just look at the evidence for. All I'm saying is look at the evidence, see which one works, and then let's apply that. Let's not just leave it there and be like, well, capitalism says they're going to make things work on their own. These people are going to rise based on their just struggling and stuff. Like, no, I don't care about ideological reasoning, because a lot of his reasoning comes from, okay, what's my ideology? And I'm going to kind of stick to it. And then maybe that works. Like, I don't care about that. I care about whether we have good outcomes for Black and brown people, good outcomes for white people, good outcomes for women, etc. Yeah, those are my points.
What about
you have anything to add?
What about Asian people?
I mean,
good outcome for Asian people too.
I think, yeah. I think we would all agree. I mean, you obviously, and this goes into like a whole other topic, but you obviously can't guarantee like equality of outcome. But I think, the best that we can try to do as a society is try to have like equality of opportunity, right?
Yes.
So where everybody can, fundamentally have the same things available to them. And oftentimes somebody like Ben Shapiro will say, well, everything's available to everybody, but but that's not inherently the truth, right? It's like
Jason,
your
you could buy a Lamborghini if you wanted to.
Yeah, exactly. So you just have to save up, you just have to work harder, but it's and and I think, and this goes into like a whole other topic, so I'm just gonna save that for later. And if it becomes relevant, I'll bring it up.
Okay.
I think it will become relevant.
All right.
Probably.
Let's keep going.
Low interest loan to buy their first house and get accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids.
The basic assumption of this video is that if your grandparents are rich in the United States, this means that you are rich in the United States. And if your grandparents are poor in the United States, that means that you are poor in the United States. This is factually untrue. The reality is that income changes over time, that there are an enormous number of people in the United States by percentage who are able to rise from poor to middle class and their children from middle class to wealthy. The biggest problem that we have in the United States right now is not a historic wealth gap. The biggest problem we have is an income gap in the United States. And there's some fascinating statistics surrounding this. There was a Harvard study recently that showed that Black males who are growing up in the same household incomes as white males were actually underperforming their white male counterparts even in high income neighborhoods. You would think that all of this might imply racism, except for one inconvenient fact in the study. Black women who are growing up in the same high income neighborhoods as white women growing up in the same high income neighborhoods, Black women were performing at exactly the same or higher rates than white women in those neighborhoods, which would suggest that there are other factors at play other than simple racism. Furthermore, the basic idea that most wealth in the United States is inherited and that millionaires are really only millionaires because their parents were millionaires, that really isn't true either. The vast majority of millionaires and billionaires are people whose parents were not millionaires and billionaires. Chris Hogan, who's a Black financial expert, he did a survey of 10,000 people, and what he found was that of those 10,000 people, 74% of millennials believed millionaires inherited their money, 52% of baby boomers did, but only 21% of millionaires received any inheritance at all. Just 16% inherited more than $100,000. Only 3% received an inheritance at or above $1 million. In reality, the best path toward wealth in this country is income mobility, not inherited wealth.
This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to...
Okay.
Do you guys hear Charlotte in the background?
I do.
Okay. I'm going to go up. Keep talking.
All right, no worries. So I just making some notes real quick.
That was a mouthful. I think he.
But
I almost feel like he. Well, I'll let you talk, but almost like he strawmanned the argument. Not strawman, but how are you saying that? Wealth changes over time.
Take a look at my crib.
Intermission. Like wealth changes over time, which I mean it's true. Like you can go from rich to poor, poor to rich, but yeah, like I would say that this does depend, like on, there's different advantages that you would have if you weren't poor trying to come up and get wealthier. That's all I'm trying to say.
I think I know what you mean. I thought about this one a lot, so I think first of all that what I do want to say is like my disclaimer is that he cited Chris Hogan. So I actually really like Chris Hogan and I really like Dave Ramsey. Like they're like pretty much financial guys, and I really like the advice that they give. And I don't know exactly what definition, right, Chris Hogan cited as, like becoming a millionaire, right? But I mean, one of the biggest indicators, I don't know why I said it so weird. One of the biggest indicators of whether you'll be successful, right, is whether your parents are successful, which is kind of like almost like a simplistically dumb, like, explanation, but it definitely affects things. I mean, you have to look at it from the standpoint of even if only 20% of people receive wealth, he said, I think like only 1% of the people that received, what's it called? Like of those millionaires, they only received like over $100,000, over $10,000, right? That's better than a lot of people that are starting $40,000 in the hole, $80,000 in the hole, etc. So I do agree, right, that I do agree. I don't disagree with him on everything, right? But I do agree with the fact that like this income and wealth inequality is one of the biggest drivers of why we have like so many of these like issues, right? But I think, you obviously can't say that, oh yeah, all these rich people, they were just born rich, that's how they're rich. That's
too
inherently
simplistic.
Dumb. Yeah, it's dumb, right? But ultimately, right, he says like tons of people have done this, right? Well, what are the statistics on that, right? How many people have done that recently under the current like environment, right? I mean, that may be a little bit more difficult to quantify. I think that
Well, if you want to quantify, I sent the link, pewtrust.org, where they have an indicator called IGE, which is intergenerational elasticity, and it basically measures the percent increase in an income that the child can expect to secure for every percent increase in the income of her or his parents. Wow. So it basically tries to correlate how well your parents do versus how well you do. And in that link, I don't know if should I share my screen or something, but on page 4, it shows that the full distribution is basically a scale from 0 to 1, and 0 means that we have very high mobile income mobility, sorry. And then if it's 1, that means you're basically sticky and there's no income mobility. And it shows, basically, it sums up what you just said, Jason, where the lower you are, you're pretty much, it's easier for you to be mobile, to move around. But if you're higher income, it's harder for you to move around. And that's probably due to the fact that if someone gives $100,000 to their kid, they're less likely to be poor. Right? So they're more likely to be sticky at the top. And when I mean sticky, means they stay at that income or roughly at the income of their parents. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that it's a 1-to-1 correlation. Every kid that gets $100K is going to be at the same income as the parent. It just says, it gives you like, it's basically correlation showing that the richer you are, the less likely for you to go down and be poor. But the good thing is, the poorer you are, you can at least move around. But to sum up the study, they say that it shows that this is in the U.S. in particular. I don't know if you're showing it on your screen.
I'm showing it.
No, we can just put the link in the description.
Yeah, it's page 4. But basically, what they say is it shows that the U.S. is very immobile. So it shows that the U.S. doesn't do a good job of allowing their people, if they're rich, to become poor, and if they're poor, to become rich, middle class, etc. And it also discusses that, or it tells us that the U.S. is worse than other high income European countries, which is not good. America should be number 1, baby. We shouldn't be in the bottom versus our European counterparts, and we are near the bottom. So
that's a great. Thank you for finding that. I do the way that I ultimately look at it, right, is like it's all a matter of like probability. Like people often throw on the arguments like, well, anybody can become rich, right? They just don't want it enough. And It's like if that was the case, so many people would be rich, right? It's just,
Mhm.
you know, ultimately the best that you can do. There's no one key way to say, oh, okay, if you do this, you will always be a millionaire. So many people
Mhm.
will be millionaires, right?
Yeah.
But I think the best thing that you can do is maximize the probability of you becoming a millionaire, right? Maybe
Yes.
picking the right careers, meeting the right people, etc. But there is no guarantee, and I just think that if you start off in a worse situation, your probability inherently starts off lower than somebody
Yes.
who starts off right in a rich family. I mean,
Yes.
look
This
at
is
it
obvious.
look at it from our perspective, right? Like we are the kids of immigrants, right? And I'm pretty much the first generation that's mostly completely growing up here in the States.
Hmm.
And now I kind of know the system, so then now I can tell my kids, okay, here's what you should do, here's what you shouldn't do, etc. So
Right.
if you have more generations of success, that knowledge and the advice that you can pass on, right, it's just inherently much higher than somebody who is like brand new or doesn't really know or hasn't had
Exactly.
successful generations.
Yeah.
So